Hello, I'm Robert Royal. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing, and this is a podcast of The Catholic Thing under the category that we're now calling The Vatican Thing because of this synod on synodality that is taking place for this entire month of October 2023. I'm delighted to be joined today by a friend, and I think probably the premier English language reporter here in Rome, Edward Pentin. Edward is British by background, as you'll soon hear, and he writes quite often for the National Catholic Register, which is published in the United States. Edward, it's good to be with you this morning.
Good to be with you, Robert. Thank you for having me.
Edward, let me start out with some broad questions because we're still a little early in the process of the synod here. But you wrote a book after the first two synods that Pope Francis conducted. There were two synods on the family in 2014, 2015. We both were there. They were quite controversial because they seemed to edge toward this acceptance of communion for the divorced and remarried. Still in confusion about what actually the document that came out of those two synods says. Doesn't say anything explicitly about it, but it kind of leaves open some kind of pastoral arrangement. But your book was about a rigging of the synod. Could you tell us just very briefly, because our charismatic thing is just briefly what you think happened back at those synods? And it seems to at least some commentators that the organizers of the synod that's going on right now learned some lessons from these previous synods and are trying to limit information, shape this synod in ways that will deliver an outcome that they desire. So,
yes, sure. Well, the interesting thing about the family synods was it kind of set the ground. If you prepared the ground rather for the synods that happened under Pope Francis. So, and the pattern that there's always been with these synods is that the apostolic tradition or divine revelation has been in many ways sidelined. That was particularly the case during the family synods, and you're seeing it again now. But it's also sort of a characteristic of all of the synods, really, under Pope Francis. So what that entails is certainly aggressively during the family synods, those who were upholding orthodoxy and the Church's teaching were aggressively cast aside. It was rather disproportionate. You had those who were pushing for a more progressive line, especially on communion for divorced and remarried. They were given more say and more prominence, if you like, than the others, and the others were rather, as I say, cast aside. So you're seeing that, and that's, as I wrote in the conclusion of the book about this, the audiatur et altera pars principle, which is to hear the arguments of both sides, was aggressively disregarded, despite the fact that it's one of the two norms of natural justice, both in canon law and civil law. So there was this great sense of injustice, I think, among not all of the participants, but some of those who were at faced the brunt of that during the family synods. And what you're seeing,
in other words, people with more traditional views were put on sort of notice that that the synod was going to go in a different direction.
Exactly. Yes.
But look, a critic might say to you, why use the term rigging for this? Any pope is going to put together a group of people to counsel him about where he wants to get to. Is that too strong a term? Or from your experience, and you have quite long experience here in Rome, was that something unusual?
Well, in a sense, there's always been an element of pressure put on the participants at a synod under John Paul and Benedict to uphold orthodoxy, to take the starting point, the point of reference would be apostolic tradition. And then from then, they would look at how that teaching could be better applied to the world today. Under Francis, though, it's the other way round, it seems. And so what you've seen is a manipulation. Yes, you could say there was perhaps rigging in previous synods, but it didn't have that controversial element to it, which is, as I say, to put aside the Church's teaching that we've had for 2,000 years. So that's why I think And also the efforts made to manipulate, I think, were much stronger and have been much stronger during these synods, precisely because it's much harder for the participants to just disregard 2,000 years of church teaching. So the efforts have been much more either subtle but still quite strong, or quite overtly geared towards manipulating the outcome.
Yeah, we remember that before the second Synod of the Family, there was a group of about a dozen cardinals who wrote a letter to the Pope, a private letter, which later was leaked, of course, because everything eventually gets leaked in Rome, objecting to the way that people had been selected on the committees and the way that the structuring was going on. I think that the thing that strikes me the most, and I'd like to ask you about this again because of your experience here in Rome, the thing that strikes me is the way that they've really been trying to limit information. Now, the Pope just said the other day that the role that journalists carry out is, of course, important. But at the same time, he seems to be saying, well, let's have a fast from news, and we don't want a lot of gossiping. But it's the nature of, I think, Catholic people who are interested in the life of the Church and the future of the Church, especially at a time like this when we seem to be so vulnerable to what's going on in the culture, that we want to know what our leaders and the people they have selected to come advise them, what's going on in the process. So there's this limitation, which I'm assuming you would agree with me is unusual, but can it work? If there are 450 people or so in the room every day together, can they possibly all remain silent like a Carthusian or something?
Yes. I mean, one can see in some ways what they're trying to do there, and you can see the benefits that they hope will come from that, in the sense that it sort of puts away some of the noise you could get from outside the media and get them to focus on the issues at hand. But on the other hand, I think it's also tending to backfire, because you're not hearing much coming from the synod, but what you are hearing is the criticism, which of course is quite free to be said outside of it. So you're getting a sort of change in narrative, really, from the ones who are organising it, not the narrative perhaps they would want. But yes, I think you're seeing that. But I think there is a concern. I was talking to a veteran journalist. He used to be retired Vaticanist actually now, but he was saying that we'd never have allowed this to happen in my day. He said to have these strict restrictions, but yeah, it's a strange. It's also strange because the Pope has been talking a lot about transparency and the importance of frankness, but when you close down the media, that doesn't seem quite consistent with that.
I noticed too that there have been some demonstrations outside of the Vatican Hall where the delegates are meeting. Just the other day, for example, Catholics for Choice, which is a pro-abortion group, obviously, and which actually contains some women who've so-called celebrated masses or things that seem like masses. They've been reported on in some of the more progressive media as standing outside and demanding equality for women and readdressing of abortion in a Catholic context. The group is small. It's 25 people, but they seem to get a disproportionate amount of coverage. I mean, certainly the progressive Catholic media cover them, but even the secular media. So I keep warning people that we need to be careful about drawing too many conclusions about what we see in the press, and we need a steadier. What we're trying to do in this series is provide a steadier voice. Is this unusual in your experience that these groups are out there, or that these specific groups are out there?
Not really, Robert. I mean, there have always been these groups, and you've often had also those campaigning for justice regarding sexual abuse, for example, and so forth. So you've often had these, but yes, they do tend to be given disproportionate attention by the secular media. Of course, they will always gravitate to any conflict and protest. But yeah, it's not really anything new, I think. Yeah.
Let me ask you another large question. We seem to be getting two contradictory messages from the organizers of the Synod. And we can tell that the cardinals, who in particular have been chosen to be the spokespersons and to do the main organizing, they've been chosen, handpicked by the Holy Father. They seem on the one hand to be saying that synodality is a new invention that the Holy Father has come up with, that it's an important element for the church to be a synodal church at this moment in its history. But that at the same time, that this is a great change, but at the same time that nothing earth-shattering is going to come out of at least this first session of the synod. How do we reconcile those two messages? Is this part of the rigging or the misdirection that some people feel is going on?
Well, I think there is a bit of that. I think it shows actually the sort of duplicity that's at work, because so much of what they say, well, rather a lot, let's say, it turns out to be untrue. I mean, the fact that they say that there's no agenda, for example, I think, as Cardinal Zen said, you must think it's an insult to our intelligence not to see that there is some agenda going on. Again, as I said just now about the need for transparency, and then the media's shut down. I think all these point to them trying to get through things, which is going to be difficult to get through. And I think that's part of the effort that they're doing to try to push all this agenda through. But I think, it's all part of that manipulation, I think, if you like. We'll have to see how it pans out, but it does seem to be that way.
Cardinal Zen said rather pointedly that we speak now of the God of surprises, but we seem to know what those surprises are going to be in advance.
Right.
Our time is getting short, so let me ask you one more question. We're still in the early days, so we don't want to read what's gone on up to this point. But if you had to predict where we're going to be a month from now, or when the Holy Father, if he does issue a document right after this session of the Synod on Synodality, where do you think we're going to be? To me, the people I talk to, we've all seen these pictures that they're all sitting around in tables, sort of like the National Prayer Breakfast in the United States. There are 400 people at all these round tables, 10 at a table or whatever it is, in one large room, and they're all talking with one another. It seemed to me that this is a process that's going to get old fast. So some people may balk even at the process. Others may balk at specifics, but I'm going to just ask you to put it on your predictor's hat and tell us where you think, just as a guess, where things might be by the end of the month.
I think we're not going to see much. I think all the talk about from Archbishop Fernandez, Cardinal Fernandez now, and others, that we're going to have too many disappointed or low expectations. The high expectations aren't going to be matched. I think we're not going to see a lot of resolution. We're not going to see many decisions after this first session. So I think we're probably not going to see much news or anything really coming out of this. I expect it'll be a lot of talking, but of course no real decisions. So it'll be a bit of a nothing burger, I think, at the end of this first session. But what I find particularly interesting so far is that it seems as though throughout this process so far that we've got essentially a suspension of church teaching coming from the prelates. And it was interesting when I asked this question of Cardinal Besungu, who's of Kinshasa, who came to the press briefing last week, and I asked him about the LGBT issue and whether they were concerned that might be passed. And he gave basically a non-answer, and not even to uphold the Church's teaching. And this goes back to what Cardinal Hollerich said a few weeks ago, that we're not going to teach during this time. So it kind of makes the prelates especially look rather odd, in the fact that when you put questions to them about the Church's teaching, they just cannot seem to answer. And I think that could be a problem going forward, especially if that lasts up until the next synod next year. And they keep saying, well, we're just going to wait and see what the synod decides and what concludes. And they can't come to any sort of conclusion. It'll be rather strange to watch, I think.
Well, the Holy Father has been talking about how listening is important in this session. So
right.
I wonder who we're listening to. Is there somebody else? If somebody else isn't speaking, what are we listening to? To be able to listen, someone else has to be speaking. Edward, thank you very much. This is very good. I'd like to have you back maybe in a couple of weeks, and we see where things are developing, if we can see where anything is.
Nothing.
But in the meantime, we all keep the faith, and we hope that
Yes.
God will bring this all to a holy conclusion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks very much, Edward, and thank you all for tuning in to this third in our series of podcasts about the Synod on synodality. I'm Robert Royal, and look forward to seeing you again next time.